Pointer had been Mifflin Gibbs's first partner in San Francisco. Nathan and his wife Sarah were among the first blacks to arrive in Victoria, and he prospered.
When I was going to school, you learned about the British and you learned about all sorts of different people. But there's really nothing about my own people. This story about the black pioneers of British Columbia, it's a big story of a small group of people and the fortitude to go forward, to embrace a new life. It's a fascinating story, really. It's a hidden story.
This is the grave of a sea captain, Jeremiah Nagel, who was responsible for bringing a large number of the first blacks here from California.
700 black people in a year and a half. We needed the population, otherwise the United States would have taken us.
This is a story about people who should not have succeeded as well as they did in a place as unlikely as Victoria, British Columbia. Canada was settled by a corporate structure, the Hudson's Bay Company. And so while the Americans had frontiersmen and cowboys and, individual settler families, the Hudson's Bay Company had clerks from the Hebrides.
So in 1849, Great Britain declares this island, Vancouver Island, a colony, even though there's probably only 40 or 50 non-Indigenous people here and something like 25,000 Indigenous inhabitants on the island. So those few people suddenly became a colony.
So this was a very small outpost here at that time. Was it a bit chaotic? Well, it was in its infancy, for sure, but certainly there were rules and regulations.
Victoria was just, it was mud in the streets and, a town just, beginning to sprout its wings.
It had only a nominal military protection, one or two Royal Navy vessels, but they knew they were in a pretty weak position, all told.
There was a definite threat that the Americans would expand north. They've already annexed Texas, they provoked a war with Mexico and seized essentially California and New Mexico, Arizona.
And there was a lot of talk about manifest destiny and how the whole North America was going to be the United States. Sir James Douglas, who was the chief factor of the Hudson's Bay Company in the West, could see that he was in a vulnerable position. You had the Russians to the north of him, the Americans to the south, and he didn't have much to back up British claims to this territory.
And with the gold rush, it really brought it all to a head. James Douglas said the gold rush would be complete trouble for them, trouble without end.
California had its own gold discovery in 1849, and that was the big one that brought hundreds of thousands of migrants, totally overwhelming the indigenous population there, the Spanish population there. But that gold rush starts to peter out, and James Douglas could see Americans poised in San Francisco looking for another opportunity, another strike to head towards. Meantime, First Nations have been trading gold. Gold was of no value to First Nations. They did not collect it, they did not value it until they noticed that the Europeans were paying a lot of money for these shiny pebbles. And so they started to trade with the Hudson's Bay Company. James Douglas, who was in charge of the Hudson's Bay Company here, he tried to keep that news quiet.
But you can't keep gold discoveries quiet. You get the first reports of Fraser River gold and Thompson River gold discoveries occurring in the few newspapers there are. They get repeated in Oregon press, and those get reprinted in California press.
So he knew he was going to suddenly find himself with an avalanche of Americans on his hands and just a few hundred clerks defend British interests.
He actually asked the British government to send out a military force to keep all foreign miners out. That is refused.
Prospectors could easily have simply declared the Republic of Fraser River, whatever. And they were all well armed, very well armed.
There was every possibility that British Columbia could have been run over and become an American state. And so if you could find settlers, you needed settlers. You needed people growing food. You needed people paying tax. You needed to create a revenue in order to build the roads.
He needed at least a civilian population that was not American. And he knew one population that had just been decreed by the Supreme Court to be non-American, and those were free blacks born in the USA.
Black population in the United States in the 1850s was a mixture of a large number of plantation slaves who were owned by white plantation owners, and free blacks who had, often they'd purchased their own freedom by working and saving money. So technically free, but really without the rights of citizens.
I mean, they were free people, but what did that entail? Not much. They were not able to actually purchase land in the States. They could rent it, they could work on somebody else's land, but it wasn't theirs.
They couldn't vote, they couldn't testify against a white man in court, they couldn't serve on juries. They were essentially unpersons.
And then a couple of really significant court cases happened in the United States in the 1850s, especially a decision called the Dred Scott decision. Dred Scott was a slave who essentially been promised his freedom, and the courts ruled that his slave owner could take him back at any time.
The Dred Scott decision had said that even a freeborn black person in the USA could never become a citizen. And this essentially consigned hundreds of thousands of people to this perpetual limbo.
California in the 1850s was a so-called free state, that there was no institutionalized slavery in California.
It was very much a white man's state. There were a lot of pro-slavery people living in it. And the black people said, what can we do about this?
A lot of these people that had fled to California, they spent their whole life running from the man, running from persecution, running from racism, running from racist laws.
They were hungry for a new opportunity and were casting around, looking north and south into Mexico, north into British Columbia. I think even some folks considered, South America as a way of escaping this prejudice.
They had to find a peace of mind. They had to find a land where they could live in peace without being persecuted because of the color of their skin. Douglas here, he had heard about their dilemma that they were in San Francisco, because of the Dred Scott decision. And he had empathy because of his background. A lot of people don't realize Douglas was biracial himself.
James Douglas had been born in what was then British Guyana. His father was Scottish, and his mother was what they called Creole, which meant that she was presumably part black and part white.
He was the right man at the right time to mold the province of British Columbia.
Especially as a mixed-race gentleman, it just made perfect sense to send an invitation down south of the border to San Francisco to say, hey, why don't you come up here? Check us out.
Come to British Columbia and settle as British citizens where they would have the right to vote and own property.
Which was just a dramatic contrast to what the Americans now offered them.
What they did was they sent a group of about 5 people up ahead of time to see if this was a legitimate reason or a legitimate letter.
They met Douglas, they looked around, they saw a lot of job opportunities. One man wrote back saying, this is a God-sent land for the colored man. So very rapidly after that news got back, something like 600 black people, men, women, children, arrived in Victoria Harbor and became new settlers.
To me, one of the great ironies and sad ironies of this migration was that they booked passage on the Commodore, and I think after they'd booked passage, the word got out that there's gold in British Columbia, so some 300 other passengers booked on the Commodore, and these were Americans, the same Americans they were fleeing, basically, the same racism and prejudice they were fleeing, hopped on the boat with them and came with them to British Columbia. So they faced the discrimination daily on the streets that they'd faced in San Francisco. But when they encountered discrimination here, then they actually did have access to the courts. And the fact that they had the vote gave them some powerful influence in the local community. So the arrival of the blacks in some ways was a real boon to James Douglas because he knew he had a population of new settlers who would help ally with him against any American expansionism. So when they wanted to form themselves into kind of a volunteer militia, James Douglas encouraged that, and so they created something called the Pioneer Rifles.
It was all black, and they trained and they wore proper 1860s uniforms. They were something of a factor in Victoria politics for a year or two. They didn't last mostly because the government by then was not afraid of being taken over by the Americans, so they didn't really need anything but the Royal Navy to protect them.
The black community that arrived in Victoria was comprised of a whole, gamut of people from entrepreneurs to laborers, barbers and restaurateurs, farmers. And so they spread out quite diversely through Victoria and British Columbia society. We can think of Charles and Nancy Alexander, who came also free blacks from San Francisco, finally settled as farmers on the Sandwich Peninsula and became one of the founding families of Shady Creek Church out there.
He built a lot of the buildings in the greater Victoria area. His wife was instrumental in all church functions, as well as gave birth to 12 children. So she was quite busy just being a mom. One of the family reunions we held had 450 some odd people come to it, and they were all direct descendants of Charles and Nancy Alexander.
Other families like the Starks and two men called William Robinson actually moved to Salt Spring Island and formed the basis of a really solid part of the Salt Spring Island community that is a black farming community.
Sylvia Stark, she was born into slavery, and her father bought them their freedom, and she came across the Oregon Trail and landed in Victoria. The Stark family, they were farmers. They planted gardens, they fished, they hunted. Sylvia's son was a cougar hunter. I mean, he was the guy that was responsible, I think, for exterminating most of the cougars on Salt Spring Island.
One of the settlers who came up in the early 1860s was John Sullivan Dease, who was the first guy ultimately to decide that you could can salmon in British Columbia and make it profitable. And so he started the first salmon cannery on what's now Dease Island, just in the Fraser River, and famous now because the Dease Island Tunnel runs underneath the island.
Mifflin Wister Gibbs was clearly the leader of the community. He had been wise enough to buy a ton of mining supplies, pickaxes, shovels, big sacks of flour, tea and coffee and so forth. And he hit the ground running in Victoria, and he did extremely well. The business boomed. He and his partner, Peter Lester, made a small fortune and then went on to other activities as well.
Politically, he was elected to city council. He represented Salt Spring Island in the Confederation debates.
Of course, after the Civil War concluded, blacks like Mifflin Gibbs, many of them went back to their old country. Mifflin Gibbs became the first black judge in United States history in Arkansas.
When he died in 1915, I think he must have been the richest black man in the United States. So many of them went back. And I often wish I could go back in time and say, don't go, because it's going to get worse again very soon.
So they didn't leave a huge population behind, but I would say that one of the things that their settlement signifies to us today is that British Columbia started as a really multicultural, multiracial society. They are, very much an important part of that early British Columbia settlement, which shows us that British Columbia wasn't very British in the early days.
Everybody knows the story of the Black Pioneers in fractional detail. What I've learned in 2 bouts of research for 2 editions of my book is that there is so much more to learn.
Legacy. You know, they were grassroots people that came here, and they planted their seeds here in terms of business and their families and to live life.
I think what they succeeded at doing was getting on with their lives as ordinary people. They showed that you could settle down, raise a family, earn a living, go to church, get your kids through school, and not have to worry too much about people burning your house down in the middle of the night. What my research has taught me is that you don't understand the big picture if you don't understand the contribution that BC's black settlers made to that picture.